Okay, well, here we are. Sarah, thank you so much for joining.
Happy to be here.
This is our very first event. The Entrepreneur's Lawyer. I'm Rebecca Gray. The Entrepreneur's Lawyer is a new project looking to provide resources and community for the startup GC. This is our first event on employee fraud, which is unfortunately more of an issue than I think most of us think it is. And Sarah is going to talk to us some more about it. So, Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Rebecca. My name is Sara Kropf. I have my own firm here in Washington, D.C. called Kropf Mosley, and we work with individuals and small businesses who are under government investigation, or we help them conduct internal investigations to figure out something that went wrong at their company.
And we have obviously someone stuffing cash into his pockets in behind our heroine who is running her company.
Yep.
So how big of a problem is this?
It's huge. And I got to tell you, like, I've done a lot of these internal investigations. And when I actually went to look at the statistics, even I was stunned. So about $50 billion a year, that's billion with a B, is lost to employee fraud. Now, employee fraud that is a big category. So that includes everything from, retail companies and, someone working at the Gap walking out with a few extra T-shirts, but it also includes very sophisticated financial fraud. Some of the scarier statistics are these, which is it oftentimes takes about 2 years to figure out that there has been fraud at your company. So it's happening and you don't know it, and that is scary. And then the size of the fraud is also important, and even for big companies and of course for smaller companies, which is 25% of the schemes, the person steals $1 million or more. And oftentimes it's somebody who has been with your company for a while. And I know we're going to talk more about this, but the statistic is people who have been at your company 5 years or more steal twice as much as recent hires. So it's not the person who's last in who you don't trust who is more likely to do this. It's the people who you trust. And it's not, these people do not have criminal records. You may run background checks on your employees, which is a good idea, a criminal background check. You're not going to see it. It's not that they're bouncing around from job to job. So it's people who haven't done this before. They take advantage of an opportunity.
That's scary.
Good morning.
So you've mentioned before that the first question is whether or not you need to hire outside counsel. Is this something that can be handled just internally? Like if I'm running my own company and I suddenly realize that something's not matching up in the books, do I need to hire a lawyer? When do I need to hire a lawyer?
So you don't always have to hire a lawyer. And I think that's important. It is expensive and can be expensive to hire a lawyer. So no, you don't always have to. It depends oftentimes on the size of the problem. So a lot of the clients who come to me have already done a little bit of digging themselves, and they have a sense, usually by the time they come to me, they know, it's in the, six figures and up size, and oftentimes into the millions. It can be helpful for smaller companies to have outside counsel because outside counsel gets to be the bad guy. So we're the ones who are coming in and asking difficult questions. We're the ones who are make people feel like they're being accused of doing something wrong. And so that can be more comfortable to outsource to outside counsel rather than having it done internally. And then there are a few other reasons you might want to use outside counsel. So there are some fields, some industries that are so highly regulated. So if you do government contracting work, if you work in the healthcare industry, there are just certain fields where there are so many self-reporting obligations where you have to report wrongdoing to the federal government by someone in your company that you want outside counsel to do that investigation, because then at least it's privileged and you can make, it's covered by the attorney-client privilege, and you can make an informed decision of what and how much you're going to disclose.
So if I'm running my own company or I've hired a lawyer, I have an in-house lawyer, I might assume that my communications with my in-house lawyer are privileged. They're not?
They would be. So if you're an executive in the company, let's say you're the founder, and you're talking to your inside lawyer, those are going to be privileged. And so if you have an in-house lawyer, they can absolutely do the investigation and it will be covered by the attorney-client privilege. It gets stickier if you have someone in HR do it. Or if you just have someone you trust within the company, maybe there are two founders and one of you decides to do the investigation. That's where it would not be covered by attorney-client privilege. And then if it is a bigger company and you get to the size where you have an internal audit function, that will not be covered by the attorney-client privilege. So it's if you have an inside lawyer, though, they absolutely can do it and maintain the privilege.
Okay. And you've said before, what if HR is involved? What?
That's the fox in the hen house. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if HR, if someone in HR is involved in the scheme, obviously then you have a problem. And we might talk a little bit about that later. But HR, oftentimes people have human resources do investigations because they involve employees, and that's a very natural thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not as though it's inherently problematic. If it's a small issue, HR can certainly do it. They oftentimes aren't trained necessarily in how to do it, and they still have the problem of interviewing the person who they have coffee with 3 times a week. So
yeah,
there are those
comfort level there. So how would you plan out an investigation for a relatively small company with where you've realized now that you have a problem?
Yep.
What do you do?
Usually the first person, whether or not you're inside counsel or outside counsel, the first person you're going to interview is the person who discovered it. And there are a few reasons for that. One, they're the ones who, can point you to where they figured it out. You also, they will likely be able to point you to the people who may have been involved in it, the person or persons who may have been involved with it. And oftentimes it's one person. And they are oftentimes at least within the function. Oftentimes it's someone in accounting or it's a bookkeeper or something like that who's pointing out something that just doesn't look right. So you're usually going to start with that person. As far as planning it, once you have at least an idea of what the issue is, you're going to plan. The two major things are people and documents. So who are you going to interview? Who do you need to interview? And then what documents do you need to look at? And most often it's, a few interviews of the people within the chain of what happened. And then the documents are, key emails from those people.
I think you've talked before about an example of when you have an accomplice, like recent investigations that you've done. How does that come to light and play out in real time?
Yeah, and it's interesting because sometimes accomplices are unwitting accomplices. So I had one investigation where it was a pretty large company, and it was someone in basically in the accounting function who was ordering, basically slipping into orders for computers, a whole bunch of MacBooks, and then having those delivered to another company location. And literally someone else in the company was helping her load them into her car and leave, and then she was selling them. And so, yeah, and it sounds crazy, but these kinds of things happen. And so, when we were interviewing people, we interviewed the person who helped her move them. And it was, well, is this person an accomplice or are they not? And it turned out in that circumstance, they weren't involved. Although, the natural questions come up is, how did you not realize that this was problematic? Right?
How many computers did you think that you needed to be moving?
Right. I mean, it's interesting though. And in that case, I know we're going to talk about this, the trust factor comes in. That person had a perfectly reasonable explanation for why she was doing this, and they believed it.
How long had you been with the company?
She'd been with the company 10, 12 years. Okay. Yeah. And had a position of trust. And I think that in my experience, that really that is the fact pattern. It's somebody who oftentimes has a position of trust and has kind of their own, their own responsibility that doesn't have a lot of oversight over it, in part because they're trusted so much. So when you're interviewing people, you are, oftentimes you have an idea of who the main wrongdoer is, but then you have to figure out who had to be involved in that process to allow it to happen. And you're interviewing those folks and checking with them. And it is, it is a judgment call, and that's where their credibility comes in, of whether or not they were involved.
Or just unwitting accomplices, I guess.
Just carrying the boxes. Yep.
Yeah. So who do you need to report these things to and why?
So Depending on what kind of company you are, there are different places you need to report them. The one, when I started doing these, that I was actually most surprised by, I was lucky that it was with a big company who had someone who handled all of their insurance matters. They were like, we need to report it to insurance. And that's because a lot of business policies have what's called a crime policy or a crime rider or employee fraud. There's a bunch of different names for it, but you're basically paying insurance if someone in your company steals things, if they forge documents, forge checks, things like that. So you definitely want to check with your insurance. You can go to your broker if you don't have someone in-house. Read your policy, which can be incredibly painful. There are lawyers who, not me, who specialize in insurance coverage if these things get sticky. But insurance companies have very strict rules about reporting. So when you find out about a potential problem, you need to look to your policy and you need to make a report, report a potential claim to the insurance company. And then the insurance company may get involved as well with the investigation, and that creates another layer of, complication.
Okay.
Oftentimes, on the slide, the law enforcement, so oftentimes your crime policy will require you to report it to law enforcement. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, if law enforcement can look into it rather than the insurance company, that makes it less expensive for the insurance company. I've always thought of it also as a little bit of a back check. If you're willing to go to the police to report it, it's less likely it's a completely false claim that you're seeking to have insurance coverage for. But you need to read that policy and make sure you follow it, or else they'll deny coverage. And then I mentioned some industries. There are some industries where you have to report this kind of wrongdoing. Government contracting in the DC area is, federal government contracting is such a big industry here. There are certain self-reporting obligations there. Healthcare industry is another one. If you're getting Medicare money, then there may be reporting obligations there. Okay. And then outside auditors. So, if you're a public company, you absolutely have to report it. Even if you're not a public company, you want to talk to your auditors, outside accountants. They can be a huge help. I know we're going to talk about it, but they can be a huge help as far as fixing the problem because they've seen this in other companies.
Yeah, it's not a new thing for them.
Yes.
So how do you message this?
So it does get a little messy and it's uncomfortable because one, particularly if you're a small company, no one likes to admit they've been defrauded. As you can tell from the statistics at the beginning, you are not alone. So you can take some comfort in that, but you absolutely, it needs to be reported up the chain. So, if you're watching this and you're, the person in accounting, you need to go up through the CFO, you need to go to management level, to officer level to report it. And then, so they definitely need to know. If you have a board of directors, they often need to know. You may not go to your board. You're not going to go to your board at the first sign of trouble. You're going to get your arms around the problem first. Oftentimes board reporting is at the end. So it's when, it's after you've done the investigation, you've actually figured out what the problem was and how you're going to fix it. You go to your board. Employees are the tougher one. So when we do internal investigations, although we try to, we get some insight about how they dress in the office, we try to blend in. We do not blend in, right? So we come in, we're sitting in a conference room interviewing people. People are going to gossip. And so you might want to message something to employees, but you want it to be very, very bland. You do not want to accuse anyone of anything. You don't know what the facts are. So we suggest that, the general counsel send out a very bland email saying, we're looking into some internal issues. You may see a few of our outside lawyers in the office, please welcome them or whatever. I mean, no one ever welcomes us, but
these are not the droids you are looking for.
Yeah, exactly. So, but we suggest something to try to tamp down the gossip. It's impossible, candidly, but you need to tell your employees something. Just if there are outside people coming in to interview, you want to give them some message.
What about when the investigation is over? What kind of messaging is appropriate at that point?
We generally, I generally tell my clients, you do not need to message, and you'll talk with HR about this too. You don't need to message, well, Jane Smith was the wrongdoer here and she's a terrible person and we fired her. I generally advise clients to message the solution that we figured out, which is, this is what happened. For example, there was someone set up a fake vendor is a very common one. Someone in accounting sets up a fake vendor, and they also have the ability to approve payments to vendors. So all of a sudden, checks are being written to, Smith Enterprises, and Smith Enterprises does not exist. So once you figure that out, you're going to try to solve that problem, which is, let's make sure it's not the same person who has both of those responsibilities. So the messaging to the employees will be, this is a change in our policy and our process now. And you don't have to message, we're doing this because Jane Smith stole $50,000.
Because Jane Smith is a bad person.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you've already started talking about this, but I think you've mentioned to me before that, like, at the very beginning, you need to start thinking about, how do we keep this from happening again? There's obviously, like, who did it, who was helping them, but what else do you need to be considering as you're trying to prevent this in the future?
Yeah, so obviously it's a person who does this, but often sort of the culprit are your policies and your practices. And oftentimes it's not your policies. So policies, if you have written policies, which are good, and we definitely advise you to have them, that's just one part of it. You have to enforce them. And oftentimes what happens is, as a company grows, or if you grow quickly, the policies just go by the wayside and people start doing what is necessary. All of a sudden you went from having 4 vendors, so one person could write all the checks, to 200 vendors. And, but you still haven't improved your accounting function enough. And so one person is doing all of this. So you're trying to find out, one, is the policy bad? So for example, you oftentimes policies have thresholds about who can approve certain payments and at what amounts. And sometimes you realize, like I did one for one company, and the CEO could approve $1 million payments alone with no one knowing about it. And this is a very small company. Even the biggest companies, the CEO of ExxonMobil cannot approve $1 million without someone else being a back check on that.
Yeah.
So you want to figure out what your policy is. You may think it's an okay policy, but in fact, it's not. But oftentimes it's the practice, and it's, who is sharing information and who is not sharing information. What report is supposed to go somewhere? If you're supposed to send a report of all vendor payments to, Sally in accounting, and that stops happening because Sally, doesn't ask for it, well, then that's a breakdown. You need to remind Sally, hey, every month you need to get the report on the vendors and do the check against, whatever other information she has.
Yeah.
So oftentimes it's the practice more than it is the written policy. And then the place where it breaks down, and I've already described it, but the phrase you'll hear your auditors talk about is segregation of duties, which you want segregation of duties. That means the person who can approve the payment to the vendor is different from the person who can write the check.
And particularly, like, the higher value items, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So in terms of prevention, let's say we don't have a problem yet. I feel like the biggest thing that you've said is, like, don't trust anyone.
Right.
or that the trust itself is the problem, right? That it's the person who's been there for a long time, you trust them, and then they start to accumulate, and maybe they've had from the beginning a lot of different responsibilities under one, in one office. And that as the company grows, perhaps the big thing that needs to be remembered is to separate things out, to, like, okay, more is at stake now, more could be stolen, people have been here longer, change maybe has happened in how trustworthy we are. What kinds of policies and procedures do we need to be putting into place as we grow?
Yeah, and most of these are focused on the financial side, and that's what we've been talking about, as opposed to the person from the Gap walking out with T-shirts. But it is, looking at every part of your process, from your accounting records, and who is looking at the entries that are going in, and at what level. So I've seen problems where, the bookkeeper is putting things in, and that's fine, but it's getting reported out at a very high level. Here are all the marketing expenses, and it's not being broken out so that they could see, well, wait a minute, why are we spending $5,000 a month on restaurants? We don't take people out to eat much, right? So some of it is the reporting, which is to make sure what is reported out is in enough detail so that someone can see some red flags. Because a lot of this is just making sure there is an opportunity for someone to see a red flag. Someone in a small company, I mean, I have a small law firm, right? My admin looks at my bank statement and she annotates it for my bookkeeper, but I'm looking at it as well. And when I grow, I'll have a CFO who will look at it. So making sure you're dividing, who's looking at the bank statement, who's looking at the accounting records, who's looking at the actual receipts that come in from employees for credit card reimbursement.
And are you getting more information beyond, hey, we're profitable, it's going well?
Exactly. It's very easy, and everyone likes good news, right? And all the companies that I've worked with, I mean, it wasn't as though this was discovered because the company was tanking. The companies were successful, and the fraud was hidden within a category on the P&L that no one was looking at. And oftentimes it's those soft categories like marketing, where a lot of different expenses can be placed. So
Is it usually somebody down the chain, or have you worked on cases where the fraud's happening at the very highest levels?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it all the way from the CEO of a smaller company. I've never seen it as CEO at, a very big company, candidly. It happens, we see it in the newspapers. But I've seen it from CEOs of small companies where the board didn't have enough oversight and where the CFO was nervous about losing her job. And so was basically doing what the CEO wanted, taking personal expenses and booking them as marketing expenses. That's one of those situations where, is that an accomplice or is it not? But I've rarely seen it as a very low level person. The ones where I've seen it most often, it's a mid-level person where they have a fair amount of responsibility and access to books of records and things like that. But they aren't at the very top.
How many employees, where you were seeing the CEO and the CFO, how many employees were in that company?
That was 11 employees. Yeah. And they had a board. I mean, they had an outside board. And so it was just that what the CFO was sort of helping and was fearful of losing her job. And the board only saw the highest level things, so they only saw marketing expenses. And so the marketing expenses weren't going up year to year. So there was no red flag for them to see. If they'd seen all the subcategories from QuickBooks, they might have noticed.
The renovation of my house.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time this morning, Sarah. And
Happy to be here.
yeah.
I'm excited I was the first one. That's great.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot.